Welcome, and tonight, we're taking a slow journey through the long and fascinating history of New Orleans. Before we begin, find a comfortable position. Settle into your chair, your bed, or wherever you like to listen. Let your shoulders relax. Let the events of the day drift a little farther away. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to accomplish. For the next little while, we'll simply follow the gentle currents of history together. Tonight, our story begins beside one of the world's great rivers. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of the Mississippi River hundreds of years ago. The air is warm and heavy. Cypress trees rise from quiet swamps. Spanish moss hangs from ancient branches. Birds call across the wetlands while the muddy river rolls steadily toward the Gulf of Mexico, just as it has for thousands of years. Long before there were streets, streetcars, jazz clubs, or wrought-iron balconies, this landscape was alive with its own rhythms. The river flooded and receded. Fish moved through the waterways. Indigenous peoples traveled these lands and waters, building communities that thrived long before Europeans ever arrived. It may seem like an unlikely place to build a city. The ground is soft. Much of the area sits at or below sea level. Summers are humid, storms are powerful, and the Mississippi River has always had a mind of its own. Yet despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, New Orleans would grow into one of the most distinctive cities in the world. Few places have such a remarkable story. Over the centuries, New Orleans would be shaped by Native American traditions, French ambitions, Spanish rule, African cultures, Caribbean influences, and American expansion. People from many backgrounds arrived here carrying their languages, customs, foods, beliefs, and dreams. Together, they created something entirely unique. The city would survive fires, floods, hurricanes, wars, epidemics, and economic upheavals. Again and again, it would adapt, rebuild, and continue forward. Along the way, New Orleans would become famous for its music, its cuisine, its celebrations, and its unmistakable character. It would give rise to new cultural traditions that would influence the entire world. But tonight, we won't rush through any of that. Instead, we'll move slowly through the centuries. We'll wander through muddy colonial streets lit by lantern light. We'll listen to the sounds of ships arriving from distant shores. We'll watch merchants unload cargo from riverboats. We'll hear church bells ringing across the settlement and imagine the conversations taking place in dozens of languages. We'll meet explorers searching for opportunity, settlers building homes in uncertain conditions, traders navigating the river's currents, and generations of ordinary people whose lives quietly shaped the city's future. As we travel through time, you'll discover that New Orleans is much more than a famous tourist destination. It is a place where geography and history combined in extraordinary ways. A city that grew at the crossroads of cultures. A place where influences from around the world blended together to create something entirely new. And through it all, the Mississippi River remains a constant companion. The river has always been the city's lifeline. It carried explorers into the interior of North America. It transported goods, people, and ideas. It brought prosperity, but also danger. Day after day, year after year, century after century, its waters flowed past the city, connecting New Orleans to distant places both upstream and across the oceans. In many ways, the story of New Orleans is also the story of the river itself. So as we begin our journey, imagine the sun setting over the wetlands. The sky glows with shades of gold, orange, and deepening blue. A warm breeze moves through the cypress trees. Somewhere in the distance, water laps gently against the shore. The centuries are waiting. The first settlements have yet to be built. The famous French Quarter does not yet exist. The sounds of jazz are still far in the future. For now, there is only the river, the wetlands, and the people who have called this remarkable place home for generations. Our story begins there. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the history of New Orleans unfold one chapter at a time. And with that, let's travel back to a time before New Orleans existed at all, to the world of the first peoples who lived along the lower Mississippi River. Our story begins thousands of years ago in a landscape shaped by water. The lower Mississippi River Valley has never been a place of stillness. For countless centuries, the river carried soil from lands far to the north, slowly building the vast delta that would eventually become southern Louisiana. The Mississippi created a world of marshes, bayous, swamps, forests, and winding waterways. The land was always changing. River channels shifted course. New lakes appeared while others disappeared. Floodwaters spread across the landscape during certain seasons, nourishing plants and animals throughout the region. To modern visitors, this environment might seem unpredictable or even difficult to inhabit. But for thousands of years, people learned to understand its rhythms. Long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, indigenous peoples had already made these lands their home. Archaeologists believe humans have lived in the Mississippi Valley for at least 12,000 years. Over many generations, communities developed deep knowledge of the region's waterways, wildlife, and seasonal patterns. They understood when fish would gather in certain channels. They knew which plants could be harvested and where game animals could be found. The landscape was not an obstacle. It was a source of life. Imagine the region as it might have appeared 1,000 years ago. Dense cypress forests rise from shallow water. Great flocks of birds wheel overhead. The air is warm and filled with the sounds of insects, frogs, and distant wildlife. Along the riverbanks, villages stand on slightly elevated ridges of land that remain dry even when surrounding areas flood. Smoke drifts upward from cooking fires. Children play near the water's edge while adults repair fishing nets, shape tools, prepare food, or carve canoes from massive tree trunks. Nearby, narrow waterways connect villages separated by many miles. Canoes move silently through the bayous, carrying people and goods from one community to another. The rivers served as highways. Long before roads existed, waterways connected much of North America. Travelers could journey incredible distances using rivers, lakes, and streams. Through these networks, ideas and goods spread across vast regions. The peoples of the lower Mississippi were not isolated. They traded with neighboring communities and sometimes with groups hundreds of miles away. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of shells, stone tools, copper, and other materials traveling far from their places of origin. The continent was connected through complex relationships long before Europeans arrived. Among the indigenous peoples who later inhabited parts of the Louisiana region were the ancestors of nations such as the Chitimesha, Houma, Bayugala, and Akalapissa. Each possessed its own language, traditions, and history. Their cultures were distinct, yet all shared a close relationship with the waterways that shaped daily life. The river influenced nearly everything. It provided fish and transportation. It supplied fertile soil for agriculture. It connected communities and served as a source of stories, traditions, and spiritual meaning. Generations grew up learning how to navigate the ever-changing landscape. Knowledge of the land was passed carefully from elders to younger members of the community. Children learned where to find edible plants. They learned how weather patterns affected travel and fishing. They learned which waterways led to neighboring villages and which routes were safest during different seasons. This knowledge represented centuries of experience. The wetlands that might confuse an outsider were familiar and understandable to those who called them home. Throughout the Mississippi Valley, larger cultural developments also emerged. Centuries before New Orleans existed, remarkable mound-building societies flourished in various parts of North America. Some constructed enormous earthen structures, ceremonial centers, and thriving settlements that became among the largest population centers on the continent. While many of these societies rose and declined over time, their influence spread through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The lower Mississippi region was part of a much larger world. To the people living here, history was already ancient. Generations had lived and died beside these waters. Stories had been told around evening fires for centuries. Communities adapted to changing conditions while preserving traditions that connected them to their ancestors. The passage of time was measured differently. There were no clocks and no calendars hanging on walls. Instead, people observed the return of migratory birds, the rise and fall of river levels, the appearance of seasonal plants, and the cycles of the moon. Life followed the rhythms of nature. The Mississippi River itself remained the constant presence. Day after day, year after year, century after century, its muddy waters flowed southward toward the Gulf of Mexico. It connected distant lands and carried life throughout the valley. The river that would one day make New Orleans prosperous was already shaping the region long before the city's founding. Then, slowly, forces beyond the horizon began setting great changes in motion. Across the Atlantic Ocean, European kingdoms were exploring new lands and seeking new trade routes. Maps were expanding. Empires were growing. Ships ventured farther from familiar shores. At first, these developments had little impact on the peoples of the lower Mississippi. The wetlands remained quiet. Canoes still moved through the bayous. Villages continued their daily routines. The river continued its endless journey south. But change was coming. Within a few generations, European explorers would enter the Mississippi Valley carrying unfamiliar languages, technologies, religions, and ambitions. Their arrival would transform the region forever. Yet before those first encounters took place, the lower Mississippi existed as a homeland shaped by thousands of years of indigenous history. A world of winding waterways and ancient forests. A world where knowledge of the land was treasured. A world where communities thrived along the river that would one day give birth to one of the most fascinating cities in North America. And as our story moves forward, distant sails are beginning to appear on the horizon of history. In the next chapter, we'll follow the French explorers who dreamed of building an empire along the mighty Mississippi River and discover how their ambitions eventually led to the founding of New Orleans. As we continue our journey through the history of New Orleans, we leave behind the world of the first peoples of the Mississippi Delta and turn our attention across the Atlantic Ocean. The story of New Orleans begins long before a single building was constructed along the river. It begins with an idea. By the late 1600s, European nations were competing fiercely for land, wealth, and influence around the globe. Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas. England was expanding its colonies along the Atlantic coast. The Dutch had built powerful trading networks. France, too, sought its place in the New World. French explorers had already established settlements in what is now Canada and along parts of the Great Lakes. One great mystery remained. Where exactly did the immense Mississippi River lead? Europeans knew of the river's existence through reports from indigenous peoples and scattered explorations. But the full extent of the river system remained largely unknown to them. To French leaders, the Mississippi represented possibility. If France could control the river, it might connect its northern settlements to the Gulf of Mexico. Such a route could unite a vast colonial empire stretching across much of North America. The dream was ambitious. In 1673, two French explorers, a missionary named Father Jacques Marquette and a fur trader named Louis Joliet, traveled southward along portions of the Mississippi. The greatest breakthrough came a few years later. In 1682, French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, set out to solve the mystery once and for all. Imagine the journey. La Salle and his companions traveled through a continent that seemed endless. They paddled canoes through unfamiliar waters, navigated shifting currents, and passed through landscapes unlike anything found in Europe. Day after day, the river carried them farther south. Forests lined the banks. Wildlife filled the wetlands. Indigenous communities lived along the waterways, each possessing knowledge of the land that far exceeded anything the explorers carried with them. Finally, after months of travel, La Salle reached the mouth of the Mississippi River, where it emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. Standing near the edge of the continent, he performed a ceremony claiming the vast Mississippi watershed for France. He named the territory Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. On paper, France had suddenly acquired an enormous empire. In reality, however, claiming land and controlling it were very different things. The territory was immense. Communication was difficult. Settlements were sparse. Most of the region remained unfamiliar even to the people who claimed it. Still, French officials believed Louisiana held tremendous promise. Maps produced in Europe often portrayed the territory as a land of opportunity. Wealthy investors imagined profitable trade routes. Government leaders envisioned strategic ports and military outposts. The Mississippi River sat at the center of these plans. Anyone who controlled the river could potentially influence trade across much of the continent. Yet the lower Mississippi posed challenges. The climate was hot and humid. Flooding was common. Mosquitoes thrived in the wetlands. Storms swept in from the Gulf of Mexico. Disease often spread quickly among newcomers unfamiliar with the environment. Many early colonists struggled to adapt. Nevertheless, French leaders remained determined. Throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries, expeditions continued to explore the region. Surveyors mapped rivers and coastlines. Officials searched for locations where settlements might succeed. One challenge quickly became apparent. France needed a reliable port near the Gulf of Mexico. Ships arriving from Europe required a place to unload supplies, transport goods, and support colonial expansion. Existing settlements along the Gulf Coast proved less than ideal. Some suffered from poor harbors. Others were vulnerable to storms or difficult to access. The search for a better location intensified. Meanwhile, life along the lower Mississippi continued much as it had for generations. Indigenous communities maintained their villages and trading networks. Canoes still moved through the bayous. The river continued its slow journey toward the sea. Yet change was beginning to accelerate. French traders arrived more frequently. Missionaries established relationships with local communities. Explorers documented landscapes and waterways. The influence of Europe gradually expanded into the region. For many indigenous nations, these encounters brought both opportunities and dangers. Trade introduced new goods, including metal tools and weapons. At the same time, European diseases spread through populations that possessed little immunity, causing devastating losses. The balance of life along the Mississippi was beginning to shift. Far away in France, however, officials focused on a different question. Where should they establish the colony's most important settlement? The answer would require a location connected to the Mississippi River, yet protected from storms. It would need access to inland trade routes while remaining close enough to the Gulf for ocean-going ships. The lower Mississippi was a landscape of swamps, marshes, and constantly changing waterways. Building a permanent settlement there would require determination, resources, and a willingness to confront difficult conditions. But among the French leadership, one man was becoming increasingly important. His name was Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville. Born in Canada and experienced in colonial affairs, Bienville spent years exploring and governing parts of Louisiana. More than most Europeans, he understood the opportunities and challenges of the lower Mississippi. As he traveled through the region, he became convinced that a particular stretch of relatively high ground along a bend in the river held tremendous potential. The location was not perfect. It was surrounded by wetlands. The climate was challenging. Flooding remained a constant concern. Yet it possessed advantages that could not be ignored. Ships could reach it from the Gulf. The Mississippi provided access to the continent's interior. Most importantly, Bienville believed it could become the center of French Louisiana. At the time, there was little indication that this muddy patch of land would one day become one of the world's most famous cities. But the dream of a French city on the Mississippi was beginning to take shape. As we continue our slow journey through the history of New Orleans, the river brings us to a moment when ideas begin to take shape in the physical world. The Mississippi is still the same powerful presence it has always been, wide, shifting, and patient. But now, human hands are preparing to build something new along its banks. Something that will eventually become a city. At the beginning of the 18th century, French officials were still struggling to turn their vision of Louisiana into reality. Explorers had mapped portions of the region, traders had passed through its waterways, and small settlements had appeared and faded. But there was still no strong, lasting center of French presence along the lower Mississippi. That would soon change. Among the French colonial leadership, one figure stood at the center of this transformation: Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville. Bienville had spent years in the region. He understood its rhythms in a way few Europeans did. He had seen how the river flooded, how the wetlands expanded and contracted with the seasons, and how indigenous nations had adapted to this environment over generations. He also understood something else. If France wanted to maintain control of Louisiana, it needed a settlement in a very specific place, a place connected to the Mississippi River, yet slightly elevated above its flood-prone surroundings, a place accessible to ships traveling from the Gulf of Mexico, but also positioned to reach deeper into the interior of the continent. After much exploration, Bienville identified a stretch of land along a broad curve in the Mississippi River. It was not beautiful in any traditional sense. It was muddy, humid, and surrounded by swamp. Trees grew in dense clusters. Water pooled in low areas. The ground could shift and soften after heavy rains. But it had one crucial advantage. It was high enough, just slightly, for a settlement to survive. In 1718, Bienville made his decision. He chose this location as the site of a new French settlement. At the time, there was no certainty that it would succeed. There were no guarantees of prosperity or survival. The environment itself seemed to resist permanent construction. Flooding was a constant threat. Heat and disease were ever-present challenges. But the French had little choice. If they wanted a foothold on the Mississippi, they needed to build. So they began. The first settlers arrived with basic supplies, tools, and supplies for survival. They cleared land along the riverbank and marked out rough plans for what would become streets. Early structures were simple: wooden buildings, storage huts, and defensive posts designed more for function than comfort. There was no grand design at first, just necessity. Life in the early settlement was difficult. The climate was harsh for Europeans unaccustomed to the subtropical environment. Summers were hot and humid. Mosquitoes were everywhere. Fresh water had to be carefully managed. Storms could quickly flood low-lying areas. And yet, people stayed. Because the location mattered. The Mississippi River was the lifeline of the entire region. It carried goods, people, and information. It connected the interior of North America to the Gulf of Mexico and, through that, to the wider Atlantic world. Anyone who controlled this stretch of river controlled access to an enormous trade network. So despite the challenges, the settlement grew. Over time, small improvements began to appear. Paths became streets. Simple wooden structures were replaced or reinforced. Trade posts developed along the waterfront. Boats came and went more regularly, bringing supplies and carrying goods deeper into the continent. The settlement slowly took on the shape of a town. But its early years were fragile. Flooding remained a constant concern. Fires occasionally swept through wooden structures. Supplies were not always reliable, and the environment itself never stopped asserting its presence. Still, the settlement endured. One of the most important early decisions was the layout of the town itself. The initial grid of streets was modest, but it established the foundation for what would eventually become the famous French Quarter. At this stage, however, there was nothing famous about it. It was simply a working settlement on the edge of a vast and often unpredictable landscape. People lived close to the river, relying on it for transportation and trade. The water was both a resource and a risk. It could bring opportunity through commerce, or destruction through flooding. This dual nature of the Mississippi shaped everything about the growing town. As more settlers arrived, the population began to diversify. French soldiers, traders, craftsmen, and laborers all played a role in building the early community. Indigenous peoples remained present in the region as well, maintaining trade relationships and navigating the changing political landscape. Over time, a complex social structure began to form. But in these earliest years, survival was still the primary concern. Every building, every supply shipment, every cleared patch of land represented effort against a powerful natural environment that had existed long before the settlement and would continue long after. And yet, the French persisted. Bienville and his supporters believed that this settlement was only the beginning. They envisioned a colonial network stretching along the Mississippi River, connecting settlements, trade routes, and military posts into a unified system. At the center of that vision was this small riverside outpost, a place that would eventually be known as New Orleans. Still, in 1718, it was just a rough settlement carved out of swamp and riverbank. No grand architecture, no bustling city streets, no cultural identity yet fully formed. Only the beginning of something that might last, or might be reclaimed by the land at any moment. But it did last, and as the years continued, this fragile settlement would slowly grow into something far more complex, shaped by migration, trade, conflict, and culture. As the early settlement along the Mississippi River continued to survive its fragile beginnings, it slowly began to change. What started as a rough outpost built from necessity was gradually becoming something more permanent, something that resembled a town. Not a grand city yet, not a cultural landmark, but a growing colonial community shaped by the river, the land, and the people trying to make a life in a difficult environment. In these early years, New Orleans was still very much a work in progress. The streets were not paved. Many paths were little more than packed dirt that turned to thick mud after rain. Buildings were simple and practical, made primarily of wood and whatever local materials could be found. The sound of construction was constant as settlers repaired damage from storms, flooding, and decay. Yet even in its simplicity, the settlement was beginning to take form. The Mississippi River remained at the center of everything. It was the highway of the colony, the source of trade, and the link between New Orleans and the wider world. Boats moved constantly along its waters, some arriving from distant ports, others traveling deep into the interior of North America. Goods, people, and news all flowed through this river system, and with them the settlement slowly grew. As more French settlers arrived, daily life began to stabilize. Soldiers were stationed to protect the colony. Traders established regular exchanges with indigenous communities. Craftsmen and laborers began building more permanent structures. Small gardens were planted, and livestock was introduced to support the growing population. Still, life was never easy. The environment demanded constant adaptation. The heat of the summer months could be intense and unrelenting. Mosquitoes thrived in the wetlands, bringing illness and discomfort. Flooding remained a persistent threat, especially during heavy rains or seasonal river rises. Despite these challenges, people stayed, because New Orleans was strategically important. It sat at a crucial point along the Mississippi River, offering access to the entire interior of the continent. Whoever controlled this location controlled trade routes stretching thousands of miles upstream. The French understood this clearly, so they continued investing in the settlement, even when conditions were difficult. Over time, the layout of the town began to take shape more clearly. Streets were organized in a rough grid pattern near the riverbank. This early design would later influence the structure of the famous French Quarter, though at this stage it was still very modest. Buildings were clustered close together for protection and convenience. Markets formed in open spaces where goods could be exchanged. The riverfront became the busiest area, filled with activity as boats arrived and departed. Life centered around the water. At the same time, the population of the settlement was becoming more diverse. French soldiers, administrators, traders, and settlers formed the core of the colonial community. But they were not alone. Indigenous peoples continued to interact with the settlement, trading goods and maintaining relationships shaped by long-standing regional networks. These interactions were complex, involving cooperation in some areas and tension in others. Over time, people of African descent also became part of the developing colony, many of them brought through forced labor under the expanding Atlantic trade system. Their presence would profoundly shape the culture, labor, and future identity of New Orleans in ways that would grow increasingly significant in the centuries ahead. Even in these early stages, the city was already becoming a meeting place of many worlds. European traditions, indigenous knowledge, and African cultural influences began to exist side by side along the river. Though the society was still small, the foundations of something far more complex were being laid. Religion also played an important role in daily life. Catholic traditions brought by the French shaped community gatherings, celebrations, and the rhythm of the calendar. Churches and chapels were among the earliest structures to appear, serving both spiritual and social functions within the settlement. But even with growing organization, the colony remained vulnerable. Floods could destroy months of work in a single season. Fires spread quickly through wooden buildings. Supply shortages were common due to the distance from other French colonies. Communication with Europe was slow and unreliable, often taking months. Every aspect of life required patience and resilience, and yet the settlement endured. One reason for its survival was its location. Despite the risks, the site chosen by Bienville and other leaders continued to prove valuable. The Mississippi River provided unmatched access to inland trade. Even when conditions were difficult, the strategic importance of the settlement ensured that it would not be abandoned. Over time, improvements were gradually introduced. Stronger building techniques were adopted. Defensive structures were reinforced. Efforts were made to better organize the growing town. Small administrative systems began to emerge to manage trade, land use, and governance. The settlement was becoming more structured, even if still far from stable. Life along the river followed a steady rhythm. Boats arrived with supplies and departed with goods from the interior. Markets opened and closed with the flow of the day. The sounds of construction mixed with the calls of traders and the movement of people through narrow streets. Slowly, a community was forming. It was not yet the vibrant cultural center New Orleans would one day become. But it was no longer just a temporary outpost either. It was becoming a town. A fragile, growing, evolving town shaped by water, weather, and human determination. And as the years passed, this small colonial settlement would continue to change in ways that few of its early residents could have fully imagined. As New Orleans continued to grow along the banks of the Mississippi River, something quietly but profoundly important was happening beneath the surface of everyday life. The town was becoming a meeting place of many worlds, not in a single moment, and not in a planned or orderly way, but gradually, through the steady flow of people arriving, leaving, working, trading, surviving, and building lives along the river. In these early decades of the 18th century, Louisiana was still a French colony. But it was never a simple extension of France. From its very beginning, it was shaped by a wide range of cultures, experiences, and histories that came together in one of the most complex colonial societies in North America. French settlers formed the administrative core of the colony. Soldiers, traders, engineers, and administrators arrived from Europe and from other French territories in North America. They brought with them language, laws, Catholic traditions, and the structure of French colonial government. But they were not alone in shaping the growing community. Indigenous nations had lived along the Mississippi River for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. As the French settlement expanded, relationships formed between colonial settlers and nearby native communities. These interactions varied widely. Some were based on trade and cooperation, others on tension and competition. Indigenous knowledge remained essential to survival in the region. French settlers depended on local expertise to navigate the wetlands, identify safe travel routes, understand seasonal flooding, and recognize which lands could support agriculture or settlement. The river was still the great connector, and along its waters, cultures met. At the same time, another population was becoming increasingly central to the development of Louisiana. People of African descent, many of them brought to the colony through the transatlantic slave trade, became a significant part of the labor force in both urban and rural areas. Their lives were shaped by extreme hardship and forced labor, but also by resilience, adaptation, and the preservation of cultural traditions carried across the Atlantic. Over time, these influences would become deeply woven into the identity of New Orleans itself. Even in these early years, the foundations of a uniquely blended society were being laid. New Orleans was not a place where cultures remained separate. It was a place where they constantly overlapped. Markets along the riverfront reflected this diversity. One might hear French spoken beside indigenous languages, alongside West African dialects, and later Spanish influences as well. Goods from different regions of the continent were traded side by side. Fish, furs, crops, tools, textiles, and handmade crafts. Daily life was shaped by this mixture of cultures. Food traditions began to reflect the blending of ingredients and techniques. Building styles adapted to the humid climate and flooding conditions. Clothing, tools, and household practices evolved in response to the environment and the resources available. Religion also played an important role in this evolving society. Catholicism, brought by the French, remained the dominant official religion. Churches and religious festivals structured much of the social calendar. But in practice, spiritual life in Louisiana was far more complex. Different communities carried their own beliefs and traditions, sometimes blending them in subtle ways with Catholic practices. Over time, this cultural mixing contributed to the distinctive spiritual landscape that would become associated with New Orleans. The colonial government attempted to organize and regulate this growing society. Laws were established to manage trade, labor, land ownership, and social order. But the reality of life along the Mississippi River was often more fluid than official documents suggested. Distance from France meant that enforcement was inconsistent. Communication was slow. In many ways, daily life was shaped more by necessity than by official structure. The environment itself continued to play a powerful role in shaping the colony's development. Flooding could disrupt entire seasons of work. Hurricanes arriving from the Gulf could damage settlements with little warning. Disease outbreaks sometimes spread rapidly through the population, especially in crowded or poorly drained areas. Survival required cooperation across communities, and cooperation often depended on shared knowledge and mutual exchange. Despite the hardships, the colony continued to grow. New settlers arrived, bringing additional layers of cultural influence. Some came voluntarily in search of opportunity. Others arrived under very different circumstances, including forced migration and indentured labor. Each group contributed, in different ways, to the development of the region. Over time, Louisiana became one of the most diverse colonies in North America. This diversity was not always peaceful or equal. There were clear hierarchies, inequalities, and systems of control that shaped everyday life. But even within those structures, cultural exchange was constant. Ideas moved across boundaries. Traditions blended. Languages influenced one another. New forms of expression began to emerge. And all of it was centered around the Mississippi River. The river was more than just a geographic feature. It was the artery of the colony. It carried goods from the interior of the continent to the Gulf of Mexico. It brought new arrivals into the settlement. It connected distant communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. It shaped trade, communication, and daily life in ways that were impossible to separate from the identity of New Orleans itself. As the years passed, the settlement became increasingly defined by this intersection of cultures. French governance, indigenous knowledge, African heritage, and the environment of the Mississippi Delta all came together in one place, producing something entirely new. Still, the colony remained fragile. It faced economic uncertainty, environmental challenges, and shifting political control from across the Atlantic world. Yet despite these difficulties, New Orleans continued to endure and slowly expand. It was no longer just a small French outpost. It was becoming a crossroads. And as we move forward in our story, outside powers begin to reshape the fate of Louisiana. The French colonial period will soon give way to Spanish rule, bringing new laws, new leadership, and new challenges that will transform the city once again. As New Orleans continued to grow along the Mississippi River, its fate took an unexpected turn, one that would reshape its streets, its buildings, and much of its cultural identity. Even though the settlement had been founded and developed under French rule, the political landscape of Europe was shifting in ways that would soon reach the distant colony of Louisiana. In the mid-18th century, after years of war and negotiation between European powers, France made a quiet but significant decision. In 1762, it secretly transferred control of Louisiana to Spain. This agreement was part of a larger diplomatic arrangement, and it was not immediately announced to the people living in the colony. For a time, nothing seemed to change. New Orleans continued to function as it had before. French language and customs remained dominant among the population. But beneath the surface, a new era was beginning. When Spanish officials eventually arrived to take control, they inherited a colony that was still developing, still fragile, and still shaped by the challenges of life along the Mississippi River. Spanish governance introduced new laws, new administrative systems, and new priorities for the colony. Yet they also had to work with the existing French-speaking population, which made the transition gradual rather than immediate. In many ways, New Orleans during this period was governed by layers of influence rather than a single, clean break from one power to another. French traditions remained deeply rooted in daily life. Spanish officials often allowed these customs to continue, especially in areas where strict enforcement would have been difficult or impractical. As a result, New Orleans became a unique colonial city where French culture and Spanish administration coexisted side by side. One of the most significant challenges during this era was the vulnerability of the city's wooden structures. New Orleans, like many early colonial settlements, was built primarily from timber and other flammable materials. Streets were narrow, buildings were close together, and fire could spread quickly under the right conditions. This vulnerability became painfully clear in the late 18th century when two major fires swept through the city. The fires caused widespread destruction. Homes, warehouses, and public buildings were lost. For the people living there, these events were devastating. But in the aftermath of destruction came opportunity for rebuilding. Spanish authorities used these disasters as a chance to reshape the city's architecture and layout. New building regulations were introduced, requiring stronger materials and more fire-resistant construction techniques. Wood gave way to brick and stucco. Buildings became more durable, more structured, and more suited to the long-term survival of the city in its challenging environment. Many of the architectural features now associated with the French Quarter were heavily influenced by Spanish rebuilding efforts during this period. Ironically, even though these changes came under Spanish rule, they are often remembered today as part of New Orleans' French character. This reflects the layered nature of the city's identity, where different periods of history blend into a single visual and cultural landscape. Life in the city also continued to evolve socially and economically. The Mississippi River remained the center of commerce. Goods flowed in from the interior of North America, furs, timber, crops, and were shipped onward toward the Gulf of Mexico and the wider Atlantic world. New Orleans functioned as a critical port connecting inland territories to global trade networks. Markets along the waterfront remained busy and diverse. People from different backgrounds exchanged goods, news, and services in a constantly shifting environment shaped by the river's rhythm. Spanish officials also focused on strengthening defenses and improving governance. Fortifications were maintained to protect the city from potential foreign threats. Administrative systems were refined to better manage trade, taxation, and land use. But despite these efforts, the colony remained complex and difficult to control fully. Distance from Spain meant that decisions made in Europe often took months to arrive. Local conditions required flexibility. The population of New Orleans, already culturally mixed from its French colonial past, continued to evolve in ways that did not always align neatly with official policy. During this period, the city's diversity continued to grow. French-speaking residents remained the majority in many parts of the settlement. Spanish officials and settlers added another cultural layer. Indigenous communities continued to live in the broader region, maintaining relationships of trade and interaction. People of African descent, both enslaved and free, played a vital role in the economy and daily life of the colony. Out of this complex mixture, a distinctive Creole culture began to take shape, one that blended language, food, architecture, and traditions from multiple origins into something uniquely local. The term Creole in this context did not describe a single group, but rather a cultural identity formed in the colony itself. It reflected the blending of influences that defined life in New Orleans more than almost anywhere else in North America at the time. Food traditions incorporated ingredients and techniques from France, Spain, Africa, and the Caribbean. Music and social gatherings reflected this same mixture of influences. Even everyday speech began to evolve in ways that reflected the multilingual environment of the city. Through all of this, the Mississippi River remained constant. It brought opportunity, but also risk. It connected New Orleans to distant markets, but also exposed it to the uncertainties of weather, flooding, and shifting trade conditions. The river shaped everything about the city's development. By the end of Spanish rule in Louisiana, New Orleans had changed significantly from the small French settlement it once was. Its buildings were stronger. Its streets were more defined. Its population was more diverse. Its culture was more complex. And yet, it remained unmistakably a river city, dependent on the Mississippi for survival, identity, and connection to the wider world. As New Orleans moved further into the 18th century, the city's identity along the Mississippi River became even more dynamic. It was no longer just a fragile colonial outpost or a growing administrative town. It had become a place defined by movement, of ships, goods, people, and stories. And along this constant movement, a more unpredictable element began to emerge. The river did not only carry official trade and government commerce. It also carried those who operated on the edges of legality, moving between empires, taking advantage of distance, confusion, and opportunity. The Mississippi River was vast, and control over it was never absolute. Ships traveling between the Gulf of Mexico and the interior of North America passed through waters that were difficult to fully regulate. Small inlets, hidden bays, and remote stretches of coastline created opportunities for private trade, both legal and illegal. This was the world in which figures like Jean Lafitte became part of local legend. Lafitte and others like him operated in a grey zone between commerce and piracy. They traded goods, provided services, and navigated the shifting boundaries of colonial law. To some, they were criminals. To others, they were essential participants in a trade system that was too large and too distant to be tightly controlled. In a city like New Orleans, where goods were constantly flowing in and out, the line between official trade and unofficial exchange could sometimes blur. The riverfront was the heart of this activity. Here, ships from distant ports arrived carrying goods that had traveled across oceans. Cargo was unloaded, stored, and redistributed into the interior of the continent. At the same time, goods from upriver, furs, timber, agricultural products, arrived to be shipped outward toward global markets. New Orleans functioned as a kind of gateway, a point where inland North America connected to the Atlantic world. This made it both valuable and vulnerable. Merchants, sailors, soldiers, and laborers all moved through the port in a steady rhythm. Warehouses lined the waterfront. Markets formed nearby, filled with a mixture of languages, accents, and currencies. Negotiations took place in crowded, noisy environments where deals could shift quickly depending on supply, demand, and trust. In this environment, informal networks often mattered as much as official regulations. Smuggling was not always seen in strictly moral terms by those living in the colony. In some cases, it was viewed as a practical response to restrictive trade policies imposed by distant governments. Goods that were difficult to obtain through official channels might still find their way into the city through unofficial routes. This created a layered economy, where legal and illegal trade existed side by side. Meanwhile, the river itself continued to shape daily life in quieter ways. Steamboats had not yet fully transformed the region, but smaller vessels were constantly moving along the water. Flatboats and canoes carried people and supplies between settlements. The journey upstream or downstream could take days or weeks depending on currents, weather, and distance. Travel was slow, but steady. Along the banks of the Mississippi, small settlements and trading posts appeared and disappeared over time. Some grew into lasting communities. Others faded as trade routes shifted or environmental conditions changed. New Orleans, however, remained central. Its location near the mouth of the river made it uniquely important. Anything moving between the interior of the continent and the ocean passed through or near the city. This ensured that even when political control changed, the city's economic significance remained. Life in the city reflected this constant motion. The streets near the river were always active. Dockworkers unloaded cargo. Merchants inspected goods. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and unfamiliar customs. Horses, carts, and pedestrians moved through narrow streets that were often muddy, noisy, and crowded. At the same time, neighborhoods slightly farther from the river developed their own rhythms. Residential areas were quieter, but still connected to the broader flow of commerce and activity. Social life in New Orleans was shaped by this constant exchange. People from different backgrounds encountered one another regularly in markets, taverns, churches, and public spaces. Languages overlapped. Customs mixed. Ideas spread quickly through conversation and trade. Music and storytelling also played an important role in this environment. While the full emergence of jazz would come later, the foundations of New Orleans' musical identity were already forming through the blending of cultural traditions along the riverfront. Rhythms brought from Africa, melodies from Europe, and local adaptations all began to influence one another in subtle ways. Public gatherings, festivals, and street performances created spaces where this cultural exchange could happen naturally. At the same time, the river remained unpredictable. Storms could flood the banks. Currents could shift. Cargo could be lost or delayed. The environment demanded constant attention from those who depended on it. Even prosperity was never fully stable. But it was precisely this uncertainty that shaped the character of the city. New Orleans was not a place of stillness. It was a place of flow, of water, goods, people, and cultures moving continuously through a shared space. And in this movement, both opportunity and risk existed side by side. As the 18th century continued, New Orleans would soon face even larger transformations. Global empires would shift their control of Louisiana once again, and the city would find itself at the center of international negotiation and change. As the 19th century unfolded, New Orleans entered a period of rapid change, one defined not just by politics or culture, but by technology. The Mississippi River had always been the lifeline of the city, but now it was becoming something even more powerful, a high-speed corridor of commerce, connecting distant parts of a growing nation in ways that were previously unimaginable. At the center of this transformation was the steamboat. Before steam power, travel on the Mississippi depended heavily on the current. Boats moving downstream could drift with relative ease, but traveling upstream was slow, difficult, and often exhausting. Flatboats and keelboats were pushed or pulled against the current using human or animal labor, and journeys could take weeks or even months. Everything changed with steam. The introduction of steamboats in the early 1800s revolutionized river travel. For the first time, vessels could move efficiently in both directions, upstream and downstream, powered by engines rather than wind or manual labor. The Mississippi River was suddenly not just a natural highway, it became a fully active transportation system. New Orleans stood at its most important point. Every major shipment traveling between the interior of North America and the Atlantic world now passed through the city. Goods flowed downriver from thousands of miles away, converging at the port before being exported across the globe. Cotton became one of the most important commodities of this era. Large plantations upriver produced vast quantities, which were transported by steamboat to New Orleans. From there, they were shipped to textile mills in Europe, especially in Britain and France, fueling the Industrial Revolution. Sugar, timber, tobacco, and grain also moved through this system in enormous quantities. The river was alive with constant motion. Steamboats themselves became a defining image of the era. Tall smokestacks rose above the decks, releasing plumes of steam into the humid southern air. Paddle wheels churned through the water, pushing vessels forward with surprising speed compared to earlier methods of travel. At night, lanterns lit the decks as boats approached the glowing shoreline of New Orleans. The city itself expanded alongside this economic growth. Warehouses multiplied along the riverfront. Docks were extended and improved. Streets near the port became crowded with laborers, merchants, and travelers from across the continent and beyond. The sounds of commerce filled the air, calls from dockworkers, the creak of wooden ships, the hiss of steam engines, and the constant movement of goods being loaded and unloaded. New Orleans became one of the busiest ports in North America. This economic growth also shaped the physical rhythm of life in the city. Markets were active from early morning until late evening. Goods from upriver communities arrived daily, while imported products from Europe and the Caribbean were distributed outward. The city functioned as a hub where regional and global trade intersected. At the same time, New Orleans was becoming increasingly diverse. The population included French-speaking Creoles, Spanish descendants, newly arriving American settlers, free people of color, enslaved laborers, merchants from different countries, and travelers passing through the port. This mixture created a vibrant but complex social environment. Different neighborhoods developed distinct identities, often shaped by language, occupation, and cultural tradition. Music and public gatherings became increasingly important in daily life. In parks, street corners, and gathering places, musical traditions from Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean continued to mix and evolve. Brass instruments, percussion rhythms, and call-and-response patterns began to influence one another more directly in public spaces. These cultural exchanges were not always formal or organized. They happened naturally through daily life, through work, celebration, hardship, and community interaction. The river remained the constant backdrop to all of it. But life along the Mississippi was not without difficulty. Steamboats, while transformative, also brought risks. Boiler explosions, fires, and accidents were not uncommon. River navigation could be dangerous due to shifting sandbars, hidden debris, and changing currents. Weather events could disrupt entire seasons of trade. And beneath the surface of economic growth, deep social inequalities persisted. The steamboat economy was closely tied to plantation agriculture, which relied heavily on enslaved labor. This reality shaped much of the wealth flowing through New Orleans during this period, even as the city itself became a center of trade and cultural exchange. It is important to recognize that the prosperity of the era was built within a system marked by profound injustice. Still, within this complex and unequal society, New Orleans continued to develop its distinctive identity. Architecture expanded. New buildings rose further from the original riverfront settlement. Churches, markets, hotels, and public spaces reflected the city's growing importance. The French Quarter, shaped by earlier Spanish rebuilding, remained a central historic district even as new neighborhoods expanded outward. The city was no longer just a colonial port. It was becoming a major American city. And through it all, the Mississippi River remained the guiding force, its steady current carrying the energy of a continent through a single, vital point. By the mid-19th century, New Orleans stood as one of the most important commercial centers in the United States, shaped by steam power, global trade, and centuries of layered history. But change was far from over. As New Orleans moved deeper into the 19th century, The city was no longer defined only by trade, politics, or even the river itself. It was defined by daily life, by the sound of footsteps on uneven streets, by voices calling across crowded markets, by the rhythm of labor along the riverfront, and slowly and steadily, by music, something that seemed to emerge naturally from the city's unique blend of cultures. New Orleans had always been a place of movement. People came and went through its port, carrying with them languages, traditions, and memories from distant places. But in the neighborhoods just beyond the riverfront, something more lasting was taking shape. A shared culture rooted in everyday experience. Markets were at the heart of this life. In open squares and along busy streets, vendors sold food, tools, fabric, and household goods. Early in the morning, the city would begin to stir as people gathered to trade and prepare for the day. By midday, the markets were full, lively, noisy, and constantly shifting. French, Spanish, African, and Creole languages could all be heard in the same space. Negotiations happened in gestures, fragments of speech, and shared understanding built over time. These markets were not just places of commerce. They were places of connection. Food played a central role in this emerging identity. Ingredients from different traditions came together in ways that reflected the city's diversity. Rice, seafood, spices, and vegetables from multiple regions were combined into meals that were shaped by both necessity and creativity. Cooking became one of the clearest expressions of cultural blending in New Orleans. But it was not the only one. One of the most important public spaces in early New Orleans was Congo Square, located just outside the formal boundaries of the French Quarter. Here, on Sundays and special occasions, enslaved and free people of African descent gathered to socialize, trade goods, and preserve cultural traditions. Music and dance were central to these gatherings. Drums, rhythm, movement, and call-and-response patterns created a living connection to African cultural roots, even as those traditions adapted to life in the Americas. Over time, Congo Square became one of the most significant cultural spaces in the city, not because it was large or formal, but because it preserved and transformed musical traditions that would later influence much of American music. The rhythms heard here did not remain confined to a single place. They spread outward into the wider soundscape of the city. In churches, public celebrations, street gatherings, and informal performances, musical ideas from different traditions began to interact more directly. European instruments such as violins and horns were played alongside percussion patterns rooted in African traditions. Caribbean influences also entered the mix through trade and migration. This blending was gradual, but powerful. Music in New Orleans was not a fixed tradition. It was something constantly evolving in response to the people who lived there. Even everyday sounds contributed to this atmosphere. The rhythm of labor along the docks, the calls of street vendors, the steady movement of horse-drawn carts across uneven streets, the distant sound of steamboats arriving and departing along the river. All of it created a kind of urban rhythm that was unique to the city. At the same time, New Orleans continued to function as one of the most important ports in the United States. Ships carried cotton, sugar, and other goods down the Mississippi River to be exported across the Atlantic. Imported goods arrived in return, filling warehouses and markets throughout the city. The economy remained deeply tied to the river's constant flow. But beneath this economic structure, everyday life remained deeply human. Neighborhoods developed their own identities. Some were close to the river and heavily influenced by trade. Others were quieter, more residential, shaped by families who had lived in the city for generations. Each area contributed to the overall character of New Orleans. Religion continued to play a steady role in daily life as well. Churches marked important events in the calendar. Festivals and holidays brought communities together. Religious traditions from Europe blended with local customs, creating practices that were both familiar and distinct. Through all of this, the city remained deeply interconnected. No single group or tradition defined New Orleans on its own. Instead, identity emerged from overlap, from constant interaction between cultures, languages, and histories. Even as social inequalities and divisions remained present, daily life required cooperation. People worked together in markets, on ships, in homes, and in public spaces. Over time, this constant interaction shaped the city's distinctive character. Music, in particular, became one of the most important ways that this shared environment expressed itself. It was not yet jazz as we know it today, but the foundations were being laid. Rhythms, improvisation, and blending of styles were becoming more common. Sound itself became a reflection of the city's layered identity. And always, in the background, the Mississippi River continued its steady movement, carrying ships, carrying goods, carrying people, carrying time forward. By the middle of the 19th century, New Orleans had become more than a port or a trade hub. It had become a cultural crossroads, a place where everyday life itself created something new. And as the city continued to grow, the forces of history, political conflict, war, and social transformation were slowly building toward a moment that would test everything the city had become. As the 19th century continued, New Orleans remained one of the most important and complex cities in the United States. It was a place shaped by centuries of layered history, French beginnings, Spanish governance, American expansion, and a deeply rooted river culture that tied everything together. The Mississippi still flowed past the city as it always had, carrying commerce, people, and change itself toward the Gulf of Mexico. But beneath the surface of daily life, tensions were growing across the country. The United States was becoming increasingly divided over political, economic, and social issues. One of the most significant and painful of these divisions centered on slavery and its expansion across new territories. New Orleans, as a major port city deeply connected to plantation agriculture and river trade, was directly tied to these systems. Cotton and sugar flowed through its docks in enormous quantities, shaping both the local economy and international trade relationships. The prosperity of the city was inseparable from the larger system of the American South. By the early 1860s, these national tensions finally broke into open conflict. The Civil War began in 1861. For New Orleans, the war would bring dramatic and immediate change. At first, the city aligned with the Confederate States of America, reflecting the broader political stance of Louisiana at the time. The Mississippi River, already a critical transportation route, suddenly became a strategic military objective for both sides. Control of the river meant control of supply lines, troop movement, and economic access to the interior of the continent. And New Orleans sat at its most important point. In 1862, Union forces launched a major naval campaign aimed at capturing the city. The approach was carefully planned and executed along the Gulf and up the Mississippi River. Despite defensive efforts, the city was unable to withstand the advance. New Orleans fell to Union forces in April 1862. The capture of the city was one of the most significant events of the Civil War. It gave the Union control over the lower Mississippi River and marked a major turning point in the conflict. For the people living in New Orleans, the change was immediate and visible. Union troops occupied the city. Federal authority replaced Confederate governance. Flags changed. Laws were enforced under new leadership. The presence of military forces became a constant part of daily life. Yet the city itself did not stop functioning. Markets remained open. The port continued to operate under Union control. The river still carried ships, though now under different regulations and restrictions. Life adapted once again to new political realities. One of the most significant long-term impacts of the war was the end of slavery. As the conflict progressed and the Union advanced its position, emancipation became a defining outcome of the war. For New Orleans, this meant a profound transformation of social and economic structures that had shaped the region for generations. The transition was not simple or immediate. Reconstruction, the period following the Civil War, was marked by political uncertainty, economic rebuilding, and ongoing social tension. Laws and systems were being redefined, and communities across the South were adjusting to a new reality. In New Orleans, this period brought both opportunity and difficulty. New freedoms created space for new forms of education, labor, and cultural expression among formerly enslaved people. At the same time, resistance, inequality, and conflict continued to shape daily life. The city remained a place of contrast and complexity. Through all of this, the Mississippi River continued its constant presence. It had witnessed colonial expansion, international trade, war, and occupation. Now it carried the city through another period of transformation. Commerce slowly resumed in new forms. The port adapted to post-war economic conditions. Railroads began to supplement river trade, gradually changing transportation patterns across the region. But the river remained central. It always did. Culturally, New Orleans continued to evolve during and after the war. Music, already deeply rooted in the blending of traditions, began to take on new forms as communities gathered in churches, public spaces, and neighborhoods. Spirituals, brass band music, and emerging performance styles reflected the lived experiences of a changing society. Out of these evolving traditions, something new would eventually emerge in the decades that followed, something that would carry the influence of New Orleans far beyond the city itself. But in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the focus was survival and rebuilding. Streets, infrastructure, and institutions all required repair and reorganization. Political systems were being reshaped at both local and national levels. The city was adjusting to a new place within a changing United States. Yet even in uncertainty, New Orleans remained resilient. Its people continued to work, trade, create, and rebuild their lives along the river that defined their existence. By the end of Reconstruction, the city had changed once again, politically, socially, and economically. But it had not lost its identity. It was still a river city, still a cultural crossroads, still a place where different histories met and continued to shape one another. And as the 19th century moved toward its close, a new cultural force was beginning to emerge from this complex environment, one that would eventually define New Orleans on the world stage. As New Orleans moved into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the city was changing again, but in a way that felt less like a break from the past, and more like a continuation of everything that had come before. Centuries of cultural blending, river trade, migration, and daily life along the Mississippi were now beginning to express themselves in a new and powerful form. Music. New Orleans had always been a musical place in some sense. Long before formal recording or written compositions, rhythm and sound were part of everyday life. Work songs on the docks, hymns in churches, street performances, brass bands in parades, and the enduring traditions preserved in places like Congo Square all contributed to a growing musical landscape. By the turn of the century, these influences were no longer just coexisting. They were beginning to merge. In neighborhoods across the city, musicians experimented with rhythm, melody, and improvisation. European instruments like pianos, trumpets, and clarinets were played alongside rhythms rooted in African traditions and Caribbean influences. The result was something new, something that could not be traced back to any single origin. It belonged entirely to New Orleans. One of the early figures associated with this emerging sound was Buddy Bolden. Bolden played in the late 1800s and is often remembered in stories as one of the first musicians to bring together blues influences, improvisation, and powerful brass band energy in a way that helped shape what would eventually become jazz. His performances were not preserved in recordings, but they lived on through memory and influence, passed from musician to musician across the city. Around the same time, other musicians were developing similar styles. Brass bands became a defining feature of New Orleans public life, especially in parades, funerals, and celebrations. These bands combined structured arrangements with moments of improvisation, allowing musicians to respond to the energy of the crowd and the moment. Music in New Orleans was not confined to concert halls. It lived in the streets. It followed processions through neighborhoods, echoed through dance halls, and drifted out of bars and gathering places along the river. One of the most important figures to later document and popularize this evolving style was Jelly Roll Morton. Morton described jazz as a music that required swing and a blend of structured composition with improvisation, an idea that reflected what many musicians in New Orleans were already practicing informally. As the 20th century progressed, the sound that had been developing for decades finally began to take a more defined shape. This new style of music would later be called jazz. At its core, jazz was not just a genre. It was a way of playing music that reflected the city itself, flexible, layered, responsive, and constantly changing. The rhythms of African drumming traditions, the harmonies of European classical music, the emotional expression of blues, and the improvisational spirit of street performance all came together in a way that felt natural in New Orleans, but revolutionary to the wider world. The city's environment played a role in this development as well. New Orleans was a place of constant movement and interaction. People from different backgrounds lived close together, worked together, and shared public spaces. Music naturally became one of the ways they communicated across cultural boundaries. It was also shaped by the city's geography. The Mississippi River continued to bring people and ideas into the city from across the United States and beyond. Steamboats had given way to newer forms of transportation, but New Orleans remained a gateway city, open to influence, exchange, and reinvention. As jazz developed, it spread outward from New Orleans in waves. Musicians traveled north to cities like Chicago and New York, carrying the sound with them. Recordings eventually helped introduce jazz to global audiences, but its roots always remained tied to the streets, neighborhoods, and riverfront culture of New Orleans. Back in the city itself, daily life continued in its familiar rhythm. Markets opened in the morning and closed in the evening. The sounds of labor and trade mixed with music drifting through open windows and doorways. Neighborhoods maintained their own identities, but the shared language of rhythm connected them all. Even as the city modernized, with new infrastructure, expanding industry, and changing demographics, the musical traditions continued to evolve rather than disappear. Jazz itself kept changing. It absorbed new influences, adapted to new settings, and reflected new generations of musicians. But its foundation remained the same: improvisation, cultural blending, and a deep connection to the lived experience of the city. And always, beneath it all, was the Mississippi River, flowing past the edges of the city, carrying with it the same quiet continuity it had for centuries. The river had witnessed the earliest indigenous settlements, French explorers, Spanish rule, American expansion, steamboat commerce, war, and rebuilding. Now it flowed past a city that was helping to reshape global music. By the early 20th century, New Orleans was no longer just known for its port or its history. It was becoming known for its sound. And among the musicians who carried that sound into the wider world was Louis Armstrong, whose early life in the city would reflect the same rich cultural environment that had shaped generations before him. From the streets of New Orleans, jazz would go on to influence music around the world, changing how people thought about rhythm, expression, and creativity itself. But in its earliest form, it was still something local, something born quietly from a city where cultures met, blended, and moved like the river itself. As New Orleans moved into the early 20th century, the city was entering a new kind of modern life. The river was still there, of course, steady, wide, and constant, but the world around it was changing more quickly than ever before. Technology, transportation, and communication were transforming how people lived, worked, and moved through the city. Streetcars began to reshape daily travel. For the first time, many residents could move farther from the riverfront and still remain connected to the economic and cultural center of New Orleans. Neighborhoods expanded outward, and the city slowly stretched beyond its original colonial footprint. Electric lights replaced gas lamps in many areas, changing the rhythm of the city at night. Streets that once faded into darkness after sunset now carried a softer glow well into the evening hours. Shops stayed open longer. Public life extended further into the night. And yet, despite these modern changes, New Orleans never stopped feeling like itself. Markets were still busy with early morning activity. The sound of vendors calling out their goods still filled the air. The riverfront remained a place of constant motion, where goods arrived from upriver and departed toward the Gulf. The Mississippi River still defined the city's economy. But socially and culturally, New Orleans was becoming even more layered. Different neighborhoods developed distinct identities. Some areas remained closely tied to older Creole traditions, while others reflected newer waves of American influence. Immigrant communities from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and the Caribbean added additional layers to the city's already diverse population. This mixing of cultures continued to shape everyday life in subtle but important ways. Food traditions evolved further, blending older Creole cooking with new influences. Music continued to develop in dance halls, street corners, and social gatherings. Public celebrations, especially Mardi Gras, grew larger and more organized over time, becoming a defining feature of the city's identity. Mardi Gras in the early 20th century was both familiar and evolving. Parades, costumes, and music brought together people from across the city, even as social divisions still shaped who could participate in different ways. Over time, it became one of the most recognizable cultural expressions of New Orleans. At the same time, the city was also experiencing the effects of broader national changes. Industrialization, migration, and urban growth across the United States influenced how New Orleans developed. Railroads became increasingly important, connecting the city to inland regions and supplementing river trade. While the Mississippi remained central, it was now part of a larger transportation network. Economic opportunities attracted new residents, while others left in search of work in growing industrial cities elsewhere. This movement contributed to a constantly shifting population, with neighborhoods evolving as different communities settled and resettled. In music, the early 20th century was a time of expansion and transformation. The foundations laid in earlier decades, brass bands, improvisation, rhythmic blending, and public performance, continued to evolve into what would soon be recognized more widely as jazz. Musicians traveled, performed, and shared their styles beyond New Orleans, helping spread the city's musical influence across the country. Even as the sound changed and spread, its roots remained deeply tied to the city's unique environment. The streets, the riverfront, the markets, and the social gatherings all contributed to a musical culture that felt inseparable from daily life. But New Orleans in this era was not only defined by cultural creativity. It was also shaped by challenges. Economic inequality remained a persistent reality. Segregation and racial divisions influenced where people lived, worked, and gathered. Public life was vibrant, but also structured by the social systems of the time, which affected opportunities and access in very real ways. These conditions shaped the lived experience of the city just as much as its music or architecture. And yet, through all of this complexity, New Orleans continued to develop its identity. A city that was modernizing, but not losing its past. Expanding, but still anchored to the river. Changing, but always recognizable. The Mississippi remained the quiet constant beneath it all. Steamboats were less dominant now, replaced by rail and newer forms of transportation, but the river still carried freight, people, and history itself through the city. Its presence was unchanged even as everything around it evolved. By the early decades of the 20th century, New Orleans had become a city defined by contrast. Tradition and innovation, celebration and hardship, local identity and global influence. And as the century continued, the city would face new tests, natural disasters, economic shifts, and cultural transformations that would challenge its resilience once again. As the 20th century continued, New Orleans entered a period shaped not only by cultural growth and modernization, but also by powerful reminders of nature's force and the city's vulnerability. For all its expansion, infrastructure, and history, New Orleans remained a city built on low ground, surrounded by water, and dependent on the careful balance between human engineering and the Mississippi River's natural behavior. That balance was never guaranteed. In 1927, one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history struck the Mississippi River basin. Heavy rains across the interior of the country caused the river to swell far beyond its usual boundaries. As water moved downstream, it overwhelmed levees and flooded vast areas across multiple states. New Orleans itself faced a serious threat, but much of the worst flooding occurred in surrounding regions, displacing hundreds of thousands of people. The scale of destruction reshaped national conversations about flood control, river management, and infrastructure. In response, major efforts were undertaken to redesign and strengthen levee systems along the Mississippi River. Engineers and government officials recognized that controlling the river required coordinated, large-scale planning rather than isolated local efforts. For New Orleans, this meant an ongoing relationship with increasingly complex flood protection systems. The city's survival depended on a combination of natural geography, human engineering, and constant maintenance. The river that had always defined New Orleans was now something that had to be actively managed. At the same time, the city continued to evolve socially and culturally. The early to mid-20th century saw continued growth in music, especially jazz and its related forms. Musicians from New Orleans continued to influence national and international music scenes, even as new styles emerged in other cities. The cultural legacy of the city was no longer just local, it was global. Tourism also began to grow as more people came to experience New Orleans' unique architecture, music, and cultural traditions. The French Quarter, shaped by centuries of layered history, became a focal point for visitors seeking a connection to the city's past. But beneath this cultural visibility, New Orleans remained a city marked by inequality and segregation. Like much of the United States during this period, the city was shaped by Jim Crow laws that enforced racial separation in public spaces, education, housing, and employment. These systems deeply affected daily life for many residents and influenced the development of neighborhoods and institutions. Despite these challenges, communities continued to build strong cultural and social networks. Churches, schools, music venues, and neighborhood organizations played important roles in sustaining life and identity. In many ways, resilience became one of the defining characteristics of the city itself. The Mississippi River continued its steady presence throughout these decades of change. Even as technology advanced and transportation systems evolved, the river remained central to the city's geography and economy. Barges replaced steamboats in many areas, carrying large quantities of goods efficiently along the waterway. The port of New Orleans remained one of the most important in the United States, connecting agricultural regions, industrial centers, and international markets. World events also shaped the city during this time. The Great Depression brought widespread economic hardship across the country, and New Orleans was no exception. Unemployment rose, trade slowed, and many families faced difficult conditions. Later, during World War II, the city experienced renewed industrial activity and military significance. Shipbuilding, transportation, and port operations increased as the United States mobilized for the war effort. Once again, New Orleans' location along the river made it strategically important. Through each of these periods, disaster, economic hardship, and global conflict, the city adapted. Its history had always been one of change and endurance. In neighborhoods across New Orleans, life continued in familiar rhythms. Markets opened and closed. Music filled streets and halls. Families gathered, worked, and rebuilt. Traditions were passed down even as the city around them evolved. And always, the river remained. Sometimes calm, sometimes dangerous, but never absent. It carried the weight of commerce, history, and time itself. By the mid-20th century, New Orleans had become a city that was both deeply historic and actively modern. Its identity was shaped by centuries of cultural blending, environmental challenge, and economic change. It was a place that had learned to rebuild, not just once, but many times. And as the century moved forward, even greater challenges would emerge. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, New Orleans stood as a city deeply rooted in history, yet constantly in motion. It had survived centuries of change, colonial transitions, war, reconstruction, economic shifts, cultural reinvention, and through it all, the Mississippi River had remained its constant companion, quietly shaping the land, quietly shaping the people, quietly shaping the rhythm of life itself. But in the early 2000s, the city would face one of the most defining moments in its modern history. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast with devastating force. The storm itself was powerful, but the most catastrophic damage came from the failure of the levee system that was meant to protect the city. As floodwaters rose and barriers broke, large portions of New Orleans were submerged. Neighborhoods were overwhelmed. Homes, schools, and businesses were destroyed or severely damaged. The disaster became one of the most significant natural and humanitarian crises in modern American history. In the aftermath, hundreds of thousands of residents were displaced. Many were forced to leave the city temporarily, while others faced long-term disruption and loss. The city's population, infrastructure, and daily life were all deeply affected. And yet, even in the midst of devastation, something familiar remained. The river. The Mississippi continued its steady flow, unchanged by human tragedy, carrying water from distant lands to the Gulf of Mexico, just as it always had. It served as a reminder that while cities rise and fall along its banks, the river itself endures. In the months and years that followed, New Orleans began the long process of rebuilding. Recovery was not simple or uniform. Some neighborhoods recovered quickly, while others faced prolonged challenges. Infrastructure had to be repaired or redesigned. Homes had to be rebuilt. Communities had to reconnect after displacement. But gradually, life returned. And as it did, the cultural identity of New Orleans once again became central to its recovery. Music was among the first things to re-emerge. Brass bands returned to the streets. Second-line parades resumed in neighborhoods, rebuilding their sense of community. Jazz, blues, gospel, and funk, long rooted in the city's history, became expressions not only of tradition, but of resilience. In many ways, music helped the city heal. Tourism also played a role in the recovery of New Orleans. Visitors from around the world came to experience its unique architecture, food, and cultural traditions. The French Quarter, one of the oldest and most recognizable parts of the city, remained a focal point for both history and celebration. Events like Mardi Gras and the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival continued to grow, drawing large crowds and showcasing the city's ongoing cultural vitality. These celebrations reflected both continuity and renewal, honoring the past while embracing the present. At the same time, New Orleans continued to evolve socially and economically. Rebuilding brought new investments and redevelopment efforts. Some areas saw revitalization, while others faced ongoing debates about equity, displacement, and long-term recovery. The city's future, like its past, was shaped by complex and sometimes difficult decisions. Yet through it all, the identity of New Orleans remained deeply tied to its people and its culture. Neighborhood life returned in many places, shaped by long-standing traditions and new beginnings. Schools reopened. Businesses restarted. Families rebuilt routines that had been disrupted. Slowly, the rhythm of daily life returned, even if it was different than before. The Mississippi River, still flowing beside the city, continued to serve as both a practical and symbolic presence. It carried commerce through the port, linking the city to national and global trade networks. Barges moved steadily along its surface, transporting goods much as they had for generations. The river remained one of the most important transportation corridors in North America. But beyond commerce, it also carried memory. Every bend in the river had witnessed something: indigenous settlements, French explorers, Spanish governance, American expansion, steamboat commerce, war, migration, music, celebration, and disaster. New Orleans existed within that long current of history. In the years following Katrina, the city's cultural influence continued to grow once again. Musicians, artists, chefs, and writers contributed to a renewed global interest in New Orleans culture. The city's food, rich with Creole, African, French, and Spanish influences, remained one of its most recognizable expressions. Jazz, blues, and brass band traditions continued to evolve, passed down through generations while also adapting to new audiences and styles. And perhaps most importantly, the spirit of the city endured, not in a single moment or event, but in countless small acts of rebuilding, remembering, and continuing. New Orleans has never been a static place. It has always been shaped by change, by water, by weather, by migration, by culture, and by time itself. It is a city that has been rebuilt more than once. A city that has absorbed influences from around the world while remaining unmistakably itself. A city that exists in many ways, like the river beside it, constantly moving, constantly reshaping, yet always flowing forward. And as we reach the end of this journey through its history, we are left not with an ending, but with a continuation. Because New Orleans is not only something that happened in the past, it is something that is still happening now. In its music drifting through evening air, in its streets filled with conversation and rhythm, in its food, its festivals, its architecture, and its memory, and in the steady presence of the Mississippi River, carrying all of it forward. So as this story gently comes to rest, imagine the river continuing its quiet journey toward the sea, the lights of the city reflecting softly on the water, the sound of distant music fading into the night, and a place that, even after everything it has endured, still remains alive with history. And now, as this long journey through New Orleans begins to settle, there is nothing left to do but drift gently backward through it all, not as history alone, but as memory. Picture the Mississippi River first, not as a map or a line on a page, but as something alive and continuous, a wide, slow-moving current carrying everything that has ever happened along its banks. Ancient villages, French sails, Spanish flags, American steamboats, jazz-filled streets, floodwaters, rebuilding, celebration, loss, all of it still moving forward, even now. The river does not pause for chapters or centuries. It only flows. And along that flow, New Orleans appears like a constant companion, rising, falling, changing shape, but never disappearing. You can imagine the earliest days again. Cypress trees standing in shallow water, canoes slipping through quiet bayous. The first French explorers arriving with maps that could not yet capture the land they were entering. A settlement forming slowly on a muddy curve of riverbank, uncertain whether it would last. Then the years layering in. Spanish rebuilding after fire. Streets redrawn in stronger stone and brick. Iron balconies beginning to overlook narrow roads. Markets filling with voices that do not match, but somehow understand each other anyway. And always, the river nearby. Carrying goods. Carrying people. Carrying time itself. Steamboats come next, their wheels turning through thick water. Smoke rising into humid air. New Orleans growing louder, busier, more connected to distant places. Cotton moving downriver. Ships moving outward. The city becoming a hinge between worlds. And beneath it all, music begins to form, not suddenly, but slowly, like a language learning itself. Brass bands in the streets. Rhythms in the squares. Congo Square echoing with drumming and movement. Improvisation taking shape not as performance alone, but as a way of living inside sound. Later, voices like Buddy Bolden, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, names carried forward not just by recordings, but by memory and influence, help shape what the world will come to call jazz. But in this moment, it is still just life. Just sound drifting through a city that never stays still. Then the harder chapters arrive. War, occupation, reconstruction, inequality, storms and floods that remind everyone how fragile the ground really is. The river rising beyond its banks in 1927. The long rebuilding that follows. The constant negotiation between water and land, between nature and human design. And still, the city remains. Not unchanged, but continuing. Through streetcars and electric lights. Through neighborhoods expanding outward. Through festivals growing larger and music traveling farther than anyone in the early settlement could have imagined. Then, more recently, the moment when water returns again with Katrina, breaking levees, flooding streets, scattering lives across distance. And yet, even there, something does not break. The rhythm. Because after the water, the city speaks again in music first. In brass bands returning to corners. In parades reforming. In voices calling out in neighborhoods rebuilding themselves one house, one street, one block at a time. New Orleans has always done this. It returns to itself through sound, through community, through the simple act of people coming back together. And now, in this quiet ending space, everything slows again. The river continues its steady movement toward the sea. The lights of the city shimmer on its surface. Somewhere in the distance, a faint trumpet line carries through warm air, then fades into night. Markets close. Streets grow quieter. History does not end, but it rests for a moment, and you can let it all drift with the current now. The explorers, the settlers, the musicians, the dockworkers, the families, the storms, the rebuilding, all of it carried forward together in one long, continuous flow. Like water, like memory, like New Orleans itself. and as the river keeps moving, you can let your thoughts move with it. Slower, softer, further away, until there is only quiet left, and the gentle feeling of a city that never really stops living. Good night.